Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 3, in the Art Scroll. We're on 11a1. Today we're getting into other Truma designations that are not valid. In other words, that's what we've been covering so far. If you're separating Truma from, say, like a deaf mute, well, that's not valid. Well, in Halacha 2, we were looking at what happens if you're separating olives for olive oil. Well, that's also not going to be valid by Bet Hillel. Now, we're going to get into a whole nother set, but I thought this Mishnah and the Halacha that comes up with it is really beautiful and brilliant and like a diamond with many facets. And it's all pulled together because what the Mishnah does is it goes through all of the Torah and pulls different restrictions from pasukim, different pasukim that are going to make it so that that you can't do it, and from each one of these different categories. So again, each one of these categories is going to be rooted in a restriction from the Torah, and that's what's so interesting about it. And I like it because it helps you to get a deeper idea and a deeper reading of the Torah. So the Mishnah starts off and it says that one may not separate truma from leket, from shkicha, or from peah, or from ownerless produce. Now, to recap, we learned this in Masechet Peah, leket, shkicha, and peah. This is going to be guaranteed by the poor, by the Torah. The Torah guarantees this to the poor, and this is actually going to be property of the poor. In other words, that even if there's a rich person that has a field and there's leket, shkicha, and peah that's on the field, well, it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the class of poor people. It's designated for him. What is going to be leket, shkicha, and peah? Well, shkicha is going to be where you had sheaves that you were collecting and you just sort of forgot a couple of the sheaves as you were harvesting grain. And leket is going to be where you have ears of grain that fall as you're gathering a harvest. And it could also, by the way, be attached with a stalk. And then you also have peah, which is going to be where there's the corner of the field, you leave it and you don't reap it. In other words, you don't harvest it, you leave it attached. And these are gifts to the poor. Now, these portions are going to be exempt from tithing obligations. We learned this before in Masechet Peah. And the idea over there in Masechet Peah was that because this belongs to someone else, and it's kind of in the category of Hefker, it's not Hefker, but it's kind of that it doesn't have obligation to tithe it. Now, there's a maloket with Rambam. The Rambam is going to be saying that it depends. So the Rosh is going to be saying that you can't designate leket, shkicha, and peah with truma and take it out as truma because the portions are exempt from all tithing obligations. So even if a poor person acquires it, it can't be used as truma. Now the Rambam is going to understand it a little bit differently. He's going to be understanding this Mishnah as talking about where you have a field that is owned, and then the owner comes and he's saying that, oh, well, I see here there's leket, shkicha, or peah laying around. Why don't I, separate tithes from it and, use it for tithes or to offset other tithes? And the answer is, says the Rambam, he can't because it's a gift to the poor. It doesn't belong to him. And because it doesn't entirely belong to him, he's unable to do any kind of tithing obligation with it. So that's the idea by the Rambam. And according to the Rambam, only the field owner is restricted from designating these portions as truma. And the Rambam is going to say there's nothing wrong with the pauper from doing it. That, by the way, in the Masechet Peah was Rav's approach. But I think that there's a lot of question about the Rambam's explanation, and I think that most of the people are going to go by the Rosh's interpretation that that inside of there it belongs to the class of the poor, and it's already designated, and that you don't need to tithe this kind of property. Now, we also see in the Mishnah ownerless property, and one can't designate Hefker, which by the way is ownerless, as truma for tevel, and that's going to be because Hefker is exempt from tithing even after somebody acquires it. So the idea is that only produce that's subject to tithing could be designated as truma to rectify not only this produce but also other produce. Now the Mishnah continues and it says, and not from the Meiser Rishon whose truma was taken. Now we already know that if there's an order to tithing, the Torah guarantees an order to tithing. It says that first you're going to take out your truma gedola, and then you're going to take out your Meiser Rishon, then you're going to take out your Trumas Meiser, and then you're going to take out your Meiser Sheni. But that's not what this Mishnah is talking about. This Mishnah is talking about what happens if you did it out of order and you took out the Meiser Rishon first, or you took out the Trumas Meiser, and then you want to go take out Truma Gedola. So the idea is now this Mishnah is talking about where you've tithed out of order, and the last part of the Mishnah about the peah, and leket is actually going to be connected to the Meiser Rishon and the Meiser Sheni in the first part of the sugya, and it's going to draw a parallel on why this is connected to a Torah verse. And it continues and it says, and not from Meiser Sheni and consecrated produce that was redeemed. So Meiser Sheni does have sanctity. It looks like this is going to be the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is saying that Meiser Sheni belongs to the divine, but you have the right to use it, and it's not actually your property. So the idea is that if it's going to be like Rabbi Meir, where it's not actually yours, and somebody took out Meiser Sheni first before they took out Truma Gedola, then how can they redeem it, because it's considered divine property, and you can't discharge a truma obligation on something that's not yours. And so, basically that's Rabbi Meir's position: it's not yours; it's divine property. So, the other case is going to be where, the Mishnah is implying that, before Trumas Meiser is removed, you're going to designate, Meiser Rishon as Truma Gedola. And basically, since Truma Gedola and Truma Meiser are both forms of Truma, the fact that the Meiser Rishon is obligated in Trumas Meiser, it's going to be enough for it to be capable of serving as Truma Gedola as well. That's what the Rosh Cirilio says. However, once Truma Meiser has been separated from the Meiser Rishon, it can't be designated as Trumas Gedola because it ceased to be subject to any kind of Truma obligation. So there's a lot of problems with tithing out of order, and you can end up doing it where you might have left some tevel in it, or you ended up where it becomes exempt, and then you've effectively stolen from the tribe of the Kohanim. So the Mishnah continues, and it says, and not from that which is obligated in Truma on behalf of that which is exempt from Truma. So that's going to be another case that's going to be connected to the Torah. What is that going to be talking about? Well, if you have something like, say, olives, and you can't exempt it on something, you can't tithe it on behalf of something that's exempt from Truma. So perhaps you have some other produce that is exempt. Why would it be exempt? Because maybe it's already been tithed. So, you can't take Truma Gedola and combine it together on something that's already been tithed as Truma Gedola. So the Mishnah continues and says, and not from that which is exempt on that which is obligated. And the Gemara is going to ask, what this adds to the previous case, which was based on this principle that produce that is exempt from tithing cannot be designated as truma on behalf of produce that's obligated, and vice versa. In other words, if you've already tithed it, you don't tithe it again. And so you can't dispatch an obligation with another grain pile on something that's already been tithed on something behalf of something that's not been tithed. So if you have two grain piles and they're next to each other, can I take out Truma Gadola for both of this pile, pile A and pile B that's next to each other? You sure can. But that's if they've both not been tithed for Truma Gadola. But if I have it where pile B has already been tithed and pile A has not been tithed, can I now say, well, I'm going to take out for pile A and B, and I'm going to take it out from pile A? You can't. And vice versa, not for B, for A either. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, and not from that which is detached from the ground on behalf of that which is attached. So we know that once something becomes detached from the ground, now you have to go process it and it becomes subject to tithing. But when it's attached to the ground, it's not subject to tithing. So what this is saying is that you can't say like, well, I have some grain over here and I have some grain over here that's still attached to the ground, and why don't I just take from this pile, pile A on behalf of pile A and also on part of what's still attached to the ground. You can't do that. And it says, and not from that which is attached to the ground on behalf of that which is detached. So again, you can't take something that's attached to the ground and then use it to tithe on behalf of the grain pile that's already been detached, because the other one isn't subject to tithing yet. And it says, and not from new crop on behalf of old crop. And this, by the way, is going to be a Torah verse that's going to have it why that is, and not from the land of Israel on behalf of produce from outside the land. That's also going to have a Torah verse saying why that is, nor from produce of outside the land on behalf of produce in the land. So let's go through some of these Torah verses on it. So produce from Eretz Yisrael can't be designated as truma for produce outside of Eretz Yisrael. Why? Well, that's in Torah. In Vayikra 27:30, it says, regarding Meiser Sheni, it says, any tithe of the land, of the seed of the land. And what this is saying, what the Rambam says about this in his commentary in the Mishnah, is that this is a lesson inferred from this and other verses applied to the various tithes, because all of the tithes are conceptually the same. And basically, this is talking about, where it's saying that, seed of the land is talking about for the land of Israel. So that you can't take produce from, outside of the land and tithe it for something in the land, and vice versa, because these tithes are dealing with produce in the land. And so, if you had produce that was outside of the land, it wouldn't be subject, and basically it's going to be exempt from tithing. Now, I want to look at one of the other Torah portions that is going to link back to this. So we also learned about the old crop and the new crop. You can't tithe for new crop for old crop, or old crop for new crop. And where is that going to be in the Torah? That's going to be from Devarim 14:22. It says, you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, the produce of the field, year by year. So the Mara Fulda points out that year by year is teaching that the tithes of each year's crop has to come from the produce grown in that same year. And there's another one that's also going to be, it's going to be in Devarim 18:4, and the word where over there it's going to be saying that the first of your grain, and daganecha, right? But you can revowelize it to be diganecha, which is going to mean that it's going to be gathered into piles. And that's, by the way, the Rashi commentary to explain this in Kiddushin 62a, where it's going to be saying that this is going to be saying that only cut grain and grain that can be gathered into piles is going to be subject to truma. There's also, by the way, another explanation for why you can't take something that's attached for the ground on behalf of something that's detached from the ground. And there's another proof for that comes from the Marafulda citing Rav, and it's going to be from Numbers 18:26, where it's instructing the Levim, saying, when you take from the children of Israel the tithe, Ma'aser Rishon, you shall raise up from it a gift to Hashem, a tithe from the tithe. Now, the word over here to raise up is going to be vaharemotech. Vaharemotem. The haramotem, and that means to raise up. And that's implying that you have to be able to lift up the Truma Meiser. How do you lift it up? Because it's already detached from the ground. And it's meaning that you're only talking about something that is able to be tithed because it's already detached. So there's two ways to look at that, but either way, this has a Torah verse that links it. And the Mishnah concludes with all of the following cases. And this, by the way, is going to be the position of Bet Hillel that we learned in Halacha 2, where it says, if they designated Truma in any of these circumstances, the Truma is not valid Truma. Now, the end of the Gemara is going to get into a mloket about this verse in the Mishnah, talking about the mloket between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. And basically, Bet Hillel is disqualifying all of these. In other words, if you tried to do any of these steps and you're trying to fix the tevel that's in there so that you can eat it, you didn't fix it. It still remains tevel. That's going to be the idea, and that's going to be the position by Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai, just to recap, his position is a little different. His position is that it says, like, well, if you have olives and you have oil, and you're going to tithe the olives on behalf of the oil, you didn't do anything to the oil, but you did do something on the tithe to the olives. Now, you shouldn't do it, says Bet Shammai, but if you did it, you did it, and it's still going to be fixed. So basically, in the pile of olives, that tithe is going to be valid, but over there in the olive oil, you would still have to tithe it. Bet Hillel says, no, it's not a valid tithe because it doesn't qualify. And any tithe that doesn't qualify, you basically inside of there have a portion of tevel that's still there. You didn't fix anything. You didn't do anything. So it's not a valid statement. When you go and you make the bracha to do a separation, you didn't say anything. That's going to be the idea of Bet Hillel. So he's basically saying over here that if you designate Truma in any of these circumstances, it's also still not valid. You didn't affect anything. You didn't do anything. So the Gemara gets into the leket, shiurim, and peah, and the ownerless produce, where it can't be designated as truma, and the reason why they're going to be exempt from tithing. And the Gemara is going to give a scriptural source for this explanation. And the Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yanai, his teacher, the following is one of three verses regarding Truma that are explicit in the Torah. So where is this? This is going to be, by the way, Numbers 18:12, Devarim 26:3, and also in 8:1. And what do we have here? It says, then the Levi can come and receive his maestros, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. So what is this trying to mean? This, by the way, is in Devarim 14:29. And the word over here is helek, which is denoting a portion of spoils of war. And so now helek here is going to talk about inheritance of the land. And so since the Levim do not receive these benefits, they're entitled to tithes from those who do receive them. And so the verse states clearly that the reason why the Levi is granted maestros is that unlike the rest of the Jewish people, they have no portion or inheritance. And this reason implies, and it says, now the Gemara says, from what you, the Yisrael, have, but not from what the Levi does, but he, the Levi, does not have. You are obligated to give him meiser, and excluded is ownerless produce, to which your right and his right are the same. In other words, ownerless produce doesn't need to be tithed. Why? Because a Levi has the same rights to it as a Yisrael. So since a Levi can acquire ownerless produce, it is as much his as it is yours. So since it cannot be described as what you have, but the Levi does not have, and so how is this going to get carried over? It says, furthermore, leket, shiurim, and peah are ownerless produce, and ownerless produce are the same. This, by the way, is saying that leket, shiurim, and peah are going to be exempt from tithing. So, in other words, a poor Levi has the right to leket, shiurim, and peah, and accordingly, these portions too are not classed as what you have and what the Levi does not have. So, although leket, shiurim, and peah are not actually ownerless, a poor Levi can acquire them just as he can acquire that which is ownerless. So, therefore, like ownerless produce, these portions are permanently exempt from tithing. That's going to be the idea from the Rosh in Peah 1:6. And the idea is that it's connecting together the ownerless produce. I'm sorry, that the Levi don't own produce, but they are guaranteed these tithes, which is going to be the Trumas, the Meiser Rishon, and then the poor is going to have the leket, shiurim, and peah. That's also guaranteed. So basically, over here, because this is going to be exempt from tithes, he just has to take out the truma meiser. Over here, this is going to also be exempt from tithes. And so the Mishnah then goes on to the next part, and it says that, and one cannot separate truma from that which is exempt for that which is obligated. The Gemara is going to ask, and says, but did you not already teach all of these cases? In other words, the Mishnah already taught that leket, shiurim, and peah, also ownerless produce, can't be designated as truma for tavel. Why? Because they're exempt from tithing. And produce that itself is exempt can't serve as truma for that which is obligated. So in effect, the Mishnah already taught that truma can't be separated from exempt produce for obligated produce. So why does this Mishnah seem to repeat the law? The Gemara is going to answer that the Mishnah is implying and conveying another point here. And it says, and what is this that the Mishnah means? It says, and one may not separate truma from produce that has grown a third, which is obligated for tithing, on behalf of produce that's not yet grown a third, which, by the way, is going to be exempt from tithing. Now, we covered this in Shvius. The 1/3 growth is going to be where it's a magical number for olives and also for grain, where it now, once it reaches a third, is now a viable plant. In other words, that you could take these 1/3 grown seeds that are 1/3 ripe, and you could plant it and create either another tree or another stalk of grain. And only at that point does this now qualify as being able to be tithed. So what this Mishnah is teaching, that even though produce that's not yet grown a third will eventually become subject to the tithing obligation, it currently has the status of exempt produce. So you have to look at how something is in the current state, and so it can't be designated as truma for obligated produce. Again, the idea is that if you have produce that's less than a third ripe, and you have, or a third ready, and you have, produce that's already grown a third, you can't say, well, I know that this one is eventually going to become, at least a third or more, but I'm going to use this one that's a third to tithe for the one that's less than a third. You can't do that. And, you might have thought that, says the Rosh Hashanah, that since it's automatically going to reach, a third of the full size, it's going to be considered as though, it already did reach that stage. And the Mishnah is teaching that that's not so. Rather, the grain is treated as it is in the present state. In other words, you have to look at it in the present state. And that's the Chiddush here. And also part of the Chiddush here is that you can't look at something that is something that's obligated on something that's not obligated. So, this one didn't reach that state of it being obligated yet. So that's another way to look at it. The Mishnah concludes and says, if he separated truma in any of these circumstances, his truma is not valid truma. And the Gemara is going to explain this Mishnah's final ruling that the truma is separated from obligated produce on behalf of exempt produce, and that is not going to be valid. So, according to Heskia, this ruling is the opinion of everybody. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, this is subject to dispute. So, Rabbi Yochanan here is going to say that this is really Bet Shammai's opinion. In other words, he's saying that who is the disputant here? He's saying that the Mishnah basically is Hillel's opinion, and that, as we covered, in Halacha 2, that Bet Shammai disputes it, and Heskia is basically saying that in the case of Shammai, we're talking about olives for oil or grapes for wine, and basically Heskia is saying that Shammai only agrees on those two cases, but everything else, Bet Shammai agrees like Hillel. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no. That's going to be more like a hekesh, where Bet Shammai agrees or disagrees and says, no, you can't tithe the olives for the oil or the grapes for the wine. But not only that, you can't tithe for the other cases as well. You can't tithe for grain that's from this year on behalf of grain for that year. You can't do anything that, basically, like in the case if you have grain from this year or grain from that year, Rabbi Yochanan is expanding what Bet Shammai is saying. He's saying that he would say that the grain that you did from this pile that was from last year tithed only itself, but it didn't tithe the one from this year. And Bet Hillel would say, no, you didn't tithe either of them. You didn't tithe the one from last year or the one from this year. And what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that what Bet Shammai was saying in the case of the olives, right? So you tithe the olives on behalf of the oil, and Bet Shammai says that you've tithed the pile of olives that are here, but you didn't affect anything on the oil, but you did do a valid truma separation on these olives. That's what Bet Shammai says. Bet Hillel says, no, you didn't do either on these olives or on the oil. Nothing is tithed. Yeah, you start again. And Bet Shammai is saying that you only did the tithe on the olives, not the oil. Fine. So Heskia is saying that the only two cases that this applies to is going to be in the case of the olives and the oil, the grapes and the wine, and Bet Shammai is going to agree with Hillel on everything else. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. It's not just grapes and wine, olives and oil that Bet Shammai is disagreeing on. He's disagreeing in any of these cases. So that if you had a case where you had the old and the new grain, that if you tithe from this pile on behalf of that pile, you only tithe one of the piles, not the other pile. Bet Hillel says neither pile is going to be valid. So this is going to be, according to Rabbi Yochanan, a subject of dispute. And the Mishnah is ruling that truma separated from obligated produce is exempt because it's already invalid. And this is going to be subject to the disagreement between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. And that is going to conclude what I think was a very beautiful Mishnah and Gemara, because it's all linked to different Torah verses on these prohibitions. And again, it's going to be like Bet Hillel, where if you tithe this for that, neither pile got tithed. You still have tevel in it, and you didn't affect anything. Have a great day.